Colleagues, it's good to have you here for a session which I think for many of us is probably the most compelling issue that is confronting education systems at the moment, and that is, how do you give account for the performance of your learning system? And we do have an international test program that has been hugely influential across all OECD countries in giving a sense of the performance, the relative performance of 15-year-olds around a number of key domains. It was interesting that when Tom introduced me, he said I was on the extreme right. I do agree that Yong is on the extreme left. Andreas, I think in good OECD fashion, it's neither left nor right, it's actually the work. And this afternoon we want to pose two questions. The first is, can we understand what PISA really is? What is it intended to do? And how adequate do we believe it is in undertaking that work? And so I'm going to ask Andreas in a moment if he might just lay out in your own way how you see PISA, its purpose, what's been achieved. I don't want to go into the future of PISA in this opening session, so if we can think about two parts to the session, yeah? And then, Yong, it would probably not escape people in this room if they attended the previous session that you don't have what I would call a love affair with PISA. It wouldn't necessarily be the place where you would want to spend a lot of time talking about PISA and its merits. You have been known to be quite a critic of PISA. So the delight this afternoon is that we've actually got Yong and Andreas together. This is not an easy thing to do. So this is a privileged opportunity for you to hear from two very different perspectives, but maybe not, question mark. Are they different perspectives or not? And the reason I want to have the two separate parts of the conversation is when we get into the future, I think we're going to find that we've got some very strong common views about the way in which we take learning forward and how we give account for learning in a way that can inspire systems to continue not just to improve, but actually to transform the way in which they do the business. Again, a reference, Andreas, that we made in the previous session. So there it is, two parts. After part one, I'm going to open up the floor for a few minutes, and then we'll go into part two on the future. And again, I'll invite you toward the end of that to bring your own perspectives to bear. And the great thing is we've got plenty of time. None of us here need to leave much before 7 o'clock, so just settle in. It's going to be a bit of fun. Andreas, okay, just open it up and pitch what you would see as being the nature, the purpose of PISA, and how you would assess PISA's achievements, in a sense.
I think the purpose of PISA has always been to create a global conversation on education. You know, I joined the OECD many years ago in the end of the 90s, and my first meeting of OECD ministers was one where there were 24 ministers sitting around a table, and each saying, you know, we've got the best education system in the world, and if we have a little problem left, you know, last year we put a reform in place to solve that problem.
Yep.
There was no dialogue, no discussion. When ministers of education or leaders in education meet these days, they look out to actually, what did you do in Finland? You know, how did you actually create teaching as the most attractive kind of workforce? They look to Shanghai. How did you come out so great on mathematics learning? They look to Canada. How do you ensure that actually children from wealthy and poor backgrounds have so similar kind of learning outcomes? And I think this is actually very much what has been my dream when I created this, to create a platform where people start to dialogue, to learn from each other, to learn with each other. And, you know, the International Summit of the Teaching Profession is a great example. You know, that would be unthinkable before the times of PISA, that ministers and union leaders are going to sit next to each other in an international setting to discuss the really tough issues. How do we evaluate our teachers? What are the criteria for success? How do we make teaching more attractive? And I think all of that is possible today. I wish I would see more. I think, or actually Britain, I think the academies is actually a good example. Would you have seen so many academies in Britain without PISA showing that actually entrepreneurship, local responsibility in schools is one of the key assets that high-performing education systems have. I think at least PISA has been used here to argue for that kind of environment for schooling. Or the exchange of teachers between England and China. I think it's been a fascinating experiment, bringing people across borders to learn from each other, with each other, how to teach mathematics. I don't think we see enough of that yet. Education is still a terribly inward-looking business. Now schools, are islands. I think it's true for the academies as well. I think there are amazing academies everywhere here, but are they sufficiently connected, collaborating? But I think we're making progress, and I think that's the intention, really. No?
Okay, just say a word about what it is that we are having the conversation about. So PISA not only gives us assessments in particular domains, but it also has been introducing what we might call innovative domains.
Yeah.
And there's surveying of the attitudes of educators as well. How do you think about the component parts of PISA and how they are complementary to each other?
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes PISA unique is that it's had a lot of perspectives. Now we collect data from students about their learning outcomes, about their attitudes to learning, about their beliefs, about their interests, about their future, career aspirations. But of course, we look at this always in the light of outcomes. We collect data from teachers, their approaches to teaching, and sometimes we ask teachers and students the same questions about pedagogy, and you can see sometimes they match, sometimes they don't. We collect data from parents, what are your attitudes and expectations on education? What is the value you place on education? Data from school leaders, and actually that triangulation gives you a lot of insights about how education systems function. Now, we often, and there are very different philosophies about education. In Europe, we still have a very, what I would call, industrial approach to education. We have a kind of standard curriculum that has been taught everywhere. There are other education systems with different philosophies, and that's what you see when you triangulate different kind of data sources. Now, learning outcomes, attitudes, expectations, and sometimes also the relative performance of countries changes. I give you an example. In 2015, we added collaborative problem solving. Can students actually work together to solve problems? And in the past, when I looked at individual problem-solving skills that we tested for some time, you take two big countries in Asia, Japan, China. Yeah, they come out really very well on individual problem-solving skills. If that had been the only lens, we would have rated them equally good. When we tested social skills, collaborative problem-solving, you could see the Japanese came out even better because the whole school system is geared towards collaboration. And the Chinese came out really poorly on this. So actually, every time we add a new lens, you get a new perspective on that. And you can see the same in Europe. You can see two systems that are doing equally well on math. When you add a new skill dimension, you can see important differences. So I think that's the idea, to triangulate enough data so that we get a better sense of how students learn, how teachers work, and how school systems operate.
Problem solving, this year global competence. Next, creativity. How do you determine the innovative domain that you add to each of the rounds of administration? And is it just an expression of what Yong used in his presentation in the last session about saying, well, we'll just do the 4 Cs? I mean, how do you determine where you're going to put your effort?
Well, there are two considerations. One is what is really important for young people to be successful today. If that had been the only criterion, I would have done collaborative problem solving from the start, because social skills have always been important. But there's a second consideration, and that is actually what do we know how to assess?
Yeah.
And I must say, in the past, social skills was impossible to assess. You cannot assess this with a paper. Now, when you want to assess social skills, you need to get people interacting with each other and working with each other. So we had to wait until technology was able to do that. When I talk about our new assessment of creative thinking, again, if creativity is about asking students to reproduce the answers that we have projected into the assessment, it's not very creative.
Yeah.
So basically, we need to give students space to generate new ideas, to evaluate the originality of those ideas, and that's only possible in a technology-enabled environment. In fact, in the new forms of assessment, the most interesting data you don't get out of whether students get the right answer, but you get out by following how they got the answer. You look at all this kind of big data that students generate when they actually answer the test, and they tell you actually a lot about the kind of thought process and ideas. I give you an example. When we tested problem-solving skills, you can look at Japan and the United States. When you look at the results, you get one thing. When you look at the process, in the Japanese case, for a long time you see nothing, 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 and then you see 3 clicks and the students get the answer right. So they basically look at a problem, they build a mental representation of the problem, and when they have figured out in their mind what the solution is, they type it into the computer. You look at the American students, from the very first second, they're going to play around with this parameter, that parameter, and some get it right, some get it wrong. But actually, most get it wrong. Actually, the kind of degree of correctness is much lower, but in real life, that approach to problem solving is very important in some situations. When the problem is unstructured, actually, trying to figure out the solution is not very helpful. You need to be able to try to play around with things, and you can see that in this kind of data. So I think when you look at the future, we will learn a lot more about education system, instructional processes, by following those processes and just looking at the correct answer.
Let me just ask you one more question and then bring Yong in. And that is, December, every 3 years, we release the data. It is a huge international circus. Every single government is now focused upon the results and their relative positions. I've been in places where people say that's interesting, and they move immediately to the depth of analysis in OECD reports, and more importantly, actually, for their own countries, the reports that are generated within country, which provides a totally different level of conversation and dialogue. What's your judgment about how we can ensure that the purpose of PISA and the rich data that's generated actually informs policy making and practice? Because it strikes me at the moment that we just get too easily distracted by the ranking.
And I'm not sure, actually. I see a deeper and deeper engagement with the results as time has passed by. And you can see that in the media. When the first PISA results came out, they were just headlines, number one, number two. Now you can see the New York Times coming out with a 2-page article. They didn't do that in the past. I think the debate among academics and the scientific debate is becoming very, very important among practitioners. So I think with time, people get a more kind of nuanced way of looking at the data. But I still don't discount the effect of the December every 3 years. I can tell you from my own country in Germany. Before there was PISA, everybody thought German education is really good. Everybody has a school, we pay the teachers well, everybody sits behind a desk. What problems do we have? Education is equitable because we pay the same amount for every teacher in every school. There was no attention to result. Suddenly comes our PISA, says, well, you thought you were great, but actually you're just average. And actually, the momentum this is leveraged in the public has been transformational. There would be no way that the government would have done the efforts, financially, but also in terms of processes. One of the biggest surprises in Germany was the big achievement gap between children from poor and wealthy families. That had never been addressed, and actually in the 9 years afterwards, the performance disadvantage of immigrants, for example, has been shrunk by half. The introduction of competency-based standards, that's been something that was debated for years in the academic world. Some people believe in content, others believe in competencies, completely fruitless debate. I think that would have not happened without those kinds. So I don't discount this kind of ranking effect. I don't think, in our analysis, we devote 10 out of 1,000 pages to league tables. I still think they play an important role as well. I wouldn't completely write them off.
Yong, you haven't made a secret of the fact that you're a critic of PISA. That's a question. True or false? And do you think that PISA has been transformational?
Yeah, but in a disastrous way. I think it's. I think the PISA as an enterprise has been very successful, but I think to global education, it's been more damaging than anything else. So I can tell you why. And from my perspective, number one, it really has manufactured a fantasy of excellence. I mean, the excellence PISA measures to me is not necessarily educational excellence. I mean, it claims to measure abilities, skills, or knowledge of 15-year-olds to succeed in the future, but there is no verification. For example, we don't know. Like even the creativity, critical thinking, collaborative thinking, just you claim to say we measure this, and then you take the test, then we measure this. It's like in my state of Oregon, we say, we are measuring school readiness. We give you some alphabets, letters, you read, then we reduce the number, we say, well, that's your school readiness. I think a lot of we overclaim what we measure, then you, as a result of that unverified, not really valid measure, then we make this claim, then we rank them, then we create all these school systems that we think are supposed to be excellent. For example, Shanghai, I was born and raised in China. If you go to Shanghai, most people in Shanghai don't like their system. We create these models of success which are really not successful education, and then as a result, we distort the purpose of education. So we reduce education outcomes to what measured by PISA, and so we go after that. So we drive all these governments crazy to pour resources into that, and so that's the other. We distort what education is about, and then in association with that, we kind of lead education systems to race to the past, and actually we put school system on the pedestal so they cannot change. Well, Japan is a good example. Japan was trying to reform its old-fashioned education system, introduce more kind of modernized idea, according to Joy, bring those things. But their PISA scores slip a little bit. The whole system says, no, we can't do it. So I think that's actually, you look at China, the East Asian systems really facing that problem is that, we cannot change. But if you go to East Asian education, like Tony, you were talking about, I mean, nobody in those systems are happy with what they do. They say we have good instruction outcome, but our students are not good in using even the PISA survey data. You'll see there's a negative correlation between life satisfaction and test scores, which I call the side effects of that. And so we're racing to the past, but also more important, I think, right now, when I look at PISA today, the more we expand in claiming to measure other domains, the more dangerous it become. For example, we claim to measure creativity. By definition, creativity cannot truly be measured. If you look at any creativity experts, I was just with Robert Sternberg and Ron Beghetto. Creativity is a lot about attitudes, about confidence, and also it's very domain specific. You cannot claim in all those kind of things. And again, the baby PISA come along with 5-year-olds. I'm deeply concerned about this one test program trying to narrow definition of education and then manufacture some excellent models, then force some lessons to be learned from those systems. If you look at some of the lessons we learned, I think they are deeply flawed. For example, one of them is talk about the quality of our education system cannot exceed the quality of teachers. And supposedly deriving from the PISA data, I think talk about all those high-performing systems tend to recruit teachers from high-performing graduates. But if you talk to Pasi, that's not necessarily true in Finland. When Singapore achieved its high status, it wasn't like that. It was today. It's latent effect like that. And now, but we have huge policy impact in the U.S., in Australia, trying to recruit top graduates as if our teachers, when they were dumb, they were too dumb to teach our students. But also, actually, there was a study in Sweden coming out to say top graduates from high school academically may work well for top performing students, but they are actually detrimental to students who don't perform very well. So there's different kind of qualities of this. So I'm really concerned about we draw different things. Another thing, actually, Mark Tucker draws from PISA data, trying to say high-performing systems. In the book called Surpassing Shanghai, he's talking about how we need a standardized curriculum, high-stakes testing, checkpoints, then you produce the results. You might produce the results of test scores, but that's not necessarily that's going to make you successful in the future. So I'd rather the last 20 years of PISA we might have wasted enough energy thinking about how to do this rather than trying to inventing our future. So yeah, I'm happy to say the conversations, but are we having the conversations about the right things that might matter to the future of education?
I'm going to get Andreas to respond as well, and I will, Tom, go out for comments, but I do want to just double check something else here. The critique around PISA has been alive and well and quite intense in the last few years. But let me just check one thing with you, Yong. That is that PISA has put on the map a number of capabilities, particularly in terms of problem solving, in collaborative problem solving in digital environments, and in relation particularly to what we might now call global competence, that has supported those countries that want to push into the direction of those capabilities, competencies as being absolutely fundamental for young people to have as they graduate. In other words, PISA has been a vehicle by which we've been able to value these things quite apart from the measurement of them, just simply making them part of the discourse. Also, the argument many years ago that in any of our systems, if you wanted to get outcomes of the kind that we all desire, you'd have to trade off equity and excellence. And we've now made it perfectly clear that on the measures that we're talking about, you can achieve both high quality and high excellence on narrow measures, admittedly.
I'm not sure that's true, Tony.
You don't?
Number one, collaborative problem solving has been researched a long time before
Yep.
PISA came in the game.
Right.
Patrick
But
Griffin
nobody
was
listened.
designing those systems,
Yeah.
right? And,
Yeah.
and if you look at collaborative learning, collaboration has been there for a long time. And also excellent equity is interesting. It depends on how you define it. What is excellence? If the excellence is defined the wrong way, the equity in that model doesn't matter.
Right.
Right? If you think about, like, I was right in thinking the US is a good example, the achievement gap.
Yeah.
So it's really defined by a very narrow number of test scores,
Right.
which actually has been depressing the disadvantaged. We've been addressing the equity issue in the US. The NAEP has never risen. The gap is still there. If you look at NAEP data, then the low stakes test data. So I'm not sure what you were talking about, equity and excellence, is actually addressed in the right way. It's and honestly, if we only measure a very narrow set of skills or domains, the equity gap, the equity can never be closed. Achievement gap, you can never wipe it out because schools are designed to perpetuate those things because all the measure is based on, some people not being able to do that.
Okay, microphone. Andreas, just as we get a microphone to a couple of people, a quick response.
Well, I think the test of validity, the test of truth is actually, we get some really interesting longitudinal data now, where we actually follow the 15-year-olds. So in some countries since the year 2000, you can see actually what is predictive in terms of the knowledge and skills of students, in terms of the attitude. So I'm really confident that actually PISA is measuring the right things because they're not only predicting employment and earnings, we're also predicting important social outcomes. So, in the absence of mathematics skills doesn't imply the presence of all these wonderful things that nobody knows how to conceptualize. So I think we have, and in PISA we have 15 years of work. Those people who don't believe this is important had 200 years to get it right, and I don't think we've got that. No? So I think, and in my country, in Germany, I know exactly what would have been done. Nothing if this data hadn't pushed people to pay attention to low-performing schools and disadvantaged schools. And I think the outcomes have been tremendous, not everywhere. It's, like with every instrument, you can use it for good and you can use it for bad, but I think the lack of educational improvement, we all know that the gap between what our societies require and what schools deliver isn't becoming smaller, it's become wider. There is an amazing amount of complacency in our education systems. The status quo has many protectors, and I think what PISA has done is put this to the test, and raise those questions. And the most important outcome is it gets people to talk about this. At the policy level, we are working on the ISTP, at the practitioners level, 6 changes, and I think that is really, really important. We have enough beliefs, we have enough ideology, research. What we lack is that conversation, and I wish there would be more.
Colleagues, who's hopping in here? I've got one here, and then after a couple of comments, questions, I'm going to move on to the future.
Hi, could I ask Andreas? Singapore is top of the PISA table for maths. There's also an increase in rate of suicides amongst young people in Singapore. Any connection?
Well, actually, that's PISA shows you both things. Singapore does well on maths. It comes out quite low on the PISA measures of life satisfaction, self-efficacy. So you need to look at both sides of the coin. But you know, the interesting thing is, if you look to the Netherlands, they get both parts of the equation right. They do really well in maths, and they are actually very, very strong on life satisfaction, energy. It's just wrong that there's a negative correlation between the two. Some countries are both strong on both parts. Finland, Canada, the Netherlands. Some there you see a trade-off. Korea most extremely. Now they're the number very strong on maths, very poor on life satisfaction. Singapore. And what's interesting, actually, a country like Singapore is actually listening to that. They're very, very carefully working on the design of the curriculum, on the instructional system. So I think it's a good example of a system that is very sensitive to that second part, well-being and life satisfaction. And again, you know,
Others? Yeah, thank you. Just right behind you.
Mine's for Yong. So PISA is starting a global conversation about education. If we didn't have PISA and the measurements that they use, what do you think would be a good alternative?
Well, I would like to say this. I don't think PISA necessarily started a conversation about education. Before PISA, every country was having its conversation, but not in a standardized way. You know, would you say that, you know, before like 2000, countries were not reforming? I mean, England, you remember you were messed up by all the reforms way before PISA came along. And every few years we're introducing new ways, new talks about, and now we have a global conversation, but the global conversation is very narrow and standardizing around the PISA outcomes, which actually I'm deeply concerned about. And the question about Singapore is reasonable, and maybe other countries may be exceptional. But again, I would really question the idea about what is the value of, let's say, identifying a country. Then we, like I showed Michael Gove's quote, we all descend into Singapore, learn all the great lessons. We bring all the Chinese math over here. When they are eager to ditch it, what's the point? So yes, we have a nice global conversation, but is it the right conversation? And also, I'm not sure, really, just let's say if we did not have PISA now, over the last 20 years, because of globalization, that we would not be having the conversation anyway. So that's what, of course, history, we cannot really go back to that piece. So what my point is that countries were reforming itself. And of course, you know, everybody, we capitalize, we kind of cash in a human's kind of psyche that we want to beat our neighbor, be better than your brother-in-law kind of concept. So this kind of conversation, is it a healthy conversation or not?
Andreas, let me come to you and say this. OECD is also sponsoring a major global conversation around what we're calling Education 2030. Mm-hmm. And it's entirely about what we see as the future of learning. And many countries who are high-performing countries are having that conversation themselves, but they're also coming together as part of a global community to have that conversation. How, if we're having this gathering in 10 years' time, right, or 2030, yep, which is not that far away, okay? To what extent do you think we will have shifted? Will the conversation around what we want to privilege as learning, what we want to privilege as learning, will that have changed? And how would PISA, in whatever form, partly maybe in response to the critique that we've actually had around it, but how would PISA become a valuable way of supporting a direction toward the kind of learning we think is going to be more powerful?
Yeah, I think that 2030 conversation is very important. And mind you, 2030 is what's happening in primary schools today. So yeah. I really think we need to, you know, accelerate that. And it's about finding a common understanding of what the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values are that are driving success individually and collectively among countries. Is a difficult conversation because we use different terminologies, we have different concepts, different ideas, but the aim is basically to establish a framework. This is not about telling countries what to teach and how to teach, but about positioning our approaches of learning and teaching in a kind of common language. Now, that's the idea of the 2030 framework. And the reason why we are starting this is to help us guide the longer-term development of our metrics. We actually did something very similar in the end of the 90s as well. It was called the SECO, a process that developed the kind of framework that underpins PISA, because that's the difficult thing. PISA is a global collaboration. There are 80 countries involved, and they all have different ideas. And it takes many, many years for us to actually develop a framework. And basically, having that kind of definition and then thinking about what of those aspects can we assess. But even if in 10 years' time, PISA is not capable to assess some of those dimensions because it's simply inherently difficult, still being aware of what is not assessed is also important when you actually interpret outcomes. Like when we reported the first PISA results and we, for example, were not able to assess collaborative skills or creative skills or even problem-solving skills, we still put them on the map so that people know actually these are important gaps in our understanding and knowledge base. And so that's the process, basically, to have that conversation, to build that framework, and then over time we will do as best as we can in representing this in our metrics. Because what is very clear, what you do not make visible will not improve. That is a simple lesson to learn. What is also very clear is that education is an incredibly conservative social enterprise. And as parents, we are part of the problem. You know, we get very anxious when our children learn things that we didn't learn. No? And we get even more anxious when they no longer learn things that we felt were so terribly important. So I think that is the reality, and that's why we need a really powerful narrative and framework that can guide us and make those investments that change learning environments. So I really feel that's a very, very important part of our work. It's hard work because it takes many years. It has no visibility in the sense that PISA has, but I really think that's a crucial part for us to progress.
Yong, let me just ask you this, because in the earlier session, it just struck me really powerfully that the unit of analysis, to use that kind of economic language here, right, that you were conveying to us is not the analysis of a framework, a nation coming together and agreeing that this is going to be the competency-based framework that's going to drive our systems, right? And what we're doing with 2030 is it's not just a nation, it's the collective OECD membership thinking about how that can be advanced. IBE, UNESCO has been similar work, other countries are doing work, they're all coming together, they're contributing, but it's all about what might be the most powerful framework of learning to advance young people in their respective countries with the knowledge, skills, attitudes and values that we think are necessary. You don't think about it as a framework or as a nation, you think about it as the individual. Is that right? Is that your unit of analysis? And if that is your unit of analysis, what is the connection between that, Yong, and the wider system?
Well, I mean, first of all, I really think education is about, it's very cultural. That's a big thing. I think it's any attempt to prescribe a global profile that works for everybody is just wrong. I think it's, we're not talking about every student become an economical being. We describe a society where you're all going to do this work. You know, OECD or PISA is not the future employer. That is, we're going to determine you're going to have this skill. If you have that, I'll hire you in that regard. Another thing is that every education is fundamentally value-driven too. It's about value. Like, you know, there are certain skills, creativity. In some societies, they just don't desire that. You know, they just, you know, so they don't want troublemakers. Remember those things? A lot of times, it's and there's also there's a lot of religions plays a role. So I think even as a system-wide, we may trick political leaders into believing we can describe the kind of things that everybody needs. Whatever we can prescribe for the average is not going to be sufficient for the individual. So that's number one. You know, we cannot assume there's one set of skills and knowledge that works for everybody in all contexts, in all settings. Number two, we cannot presume that everybody has the same potential, interest, capacity, opportunity to acquire the same skills at the same pace. So when you say 15-year-olds, you know, there's drastic difference across different places. But more importantly, what makes one prosperous and happy, according to one's own definition, is not cross national borders or even different borders. So we always talk about the the individual pathway, individual context, and individual situation that's necessary to consider in education.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, so let me get a microphone to people who would like to. And by the way, comments, observations are as helpful to us as questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm deputy head, so I still get to teach children, which is quite nice. Kind of to echo Yong's point, I think one of the dangerous words that we use is success, and how we measure success, and I think our narrow measure of that means that we create a very small number of winners and a very large number of losers. And I'm very conscious that in the classroom I'm kind of peddling the system's measure of success, which is very different to probably most of the children in my class. So yeah, I just wanted to
Brilliant. I'm going to get a comment on
Thanks.
that. Fantastic. Any other contribution? Here's your opportunity. Okay, I'm going to come back to both of you, because it's just struck me that this is exactly the argument, that we are looking at a world that you described before as the only certainty being uncertain, right? We're talking about a VUCA world that's going to be volatile and ambiguous and complex, and we're thinking about the fourth industrial revolution, a completely different landscape for the world of work. So to think about what the indicators of success might be, of humanness, right, is the dialogue that we actually want to have.
Absolutely.
So therefore, if that's the dialogue we want to have, Andreas, what are the terms of that conversation we want to have within our countries and globally that will be supported by the future of PISA? How will PISA help to create that dialogue and to inform it?
Yeah, you know, nobody has said or thought that everybody should learn in the same path or acquire the same skills. I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, success is multidimensional. It can be nuanced. It's really very personal. But I do think we need to have that conversation about what success means. And I think we just can't say, okay, everybody does what they want, and then it's all going to work out well. I think that is, and it's getting harder. You know, the one thing that artificial intelligence and big data and all of these things do is they push us to think much harder about what it means to be human.
Yeah.
You know, what it actually,
Yeah.
what are the kind of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that allow us to harness the power of technology and add value rather than substitute the skills that we have developed in our technologies. And I think that conversation is one that I don't think can be done in a classroom, in a school, even in a country. I do think we need the best minds of the world to think about those questions. And they're not just the academics, we have plenty of them.
Yeah.
What we need is actually the stakeholders, the people on the ground, the people who are affected by this. And that's what we're trying to do. When I look, for example, at the Education 2030 project at the OECD, yeah, we do have some researchers there, we have some policymakers there, but actually the bulk of people are, you know, employers who think about the future of work. We have people from society who think about what does social cohesion mean, people, what is the influence of diversity on students' needs. So I do think that conversation is one I think we invest far too little in the future of learning. We invest all in the present and the status quo. And the same is true for innovation. You know, in the medical sector, we spend 17 times as much on innovation in the sector than in the field of education. We invest in the future. We think about the future. In education, we have a huge machine that we just, you know, move from one year to the next. And I do think that conversation is one. And I sincerely believe that there is not going to be, it just makes no sense to have that in a national framework.
Yong, you're at the final word, and you've got 1 minute.
Well, I think, you know, that's really good intention, but I think PISA, the enterprise, precisely sends people backwards, because whatever you measure today's success is the result of past efforts. So when you encourage other countries to learn from those countries who succeed today, even that definition of success is correct. You're still learning to repeat other people's past. So there's no discourse to encourage systems to invent the future, because you're always asking the UK, you look at Finland, or you look at Netherlands. But then, even if you can learn from the Netherlands, it will take another 5 years. So in 5 years, the UK will be the Netherlands of 2018. So that's not really perpetuating the future, but rather is copying the past. So I would rather, if we could, really stop the whole game of of comparing, competing. I mean, really just more have a different format to encourage a conversation to be more innovation-oriented, the future-oriented, rather than past-oriented.
I'm going to wrap up and pass back to Tom, but let me just say this. A few years ago, I was doing a debate with Andy Hargraves and Michael Fullen. And as a good moderator, toward the end of it, I said, look, I think the wonderful thing that's emerged from this has been some consensus, yeah, that we're actually coming to the same point. And Andy stood up and he said, Tony, you must have been at a different meeting, because I completely disagree with that. So I'm not going to suggest there's any consensus other than the point that this is the debate. Yeah. This is the dialogue that we should be having in every school, in every home, in every community, and this is the one that governments should be encouraging and sponsoring, not trying to control, but actually opening it up to a discourse for all of the stakeholders. So, thank you. Tom.